So thank you all for joining us here for the final talk of the graphic design guest speaker series, one that I have personally been excitedly counting down the days for. She's been generous enough to shorten her presentation to allow for more Q&A, as you know, this is a great forum for conversation. This is being recorded, which is great, which means that hopefully the people that can't make this time zone can join it at a different one. So Dean Dori, also known as Dr. Elizabeth Dori Tunstall, hails from Columbia, South Carolina, but is now based in Toronto, Ontario. She is a design anthropologist, public intellectual, design advocate who works the intersections of critical theory, culture, and design. As Dean of Design at Ontario College of Art and Design University, or OCAD, as you may have seen it, she is the first Black and Black female Dean of Faculty of Design anywhere. She leads the Cultures-Based Innovation Initiative focused on using old ways of knowing to drive innovation processes that directly benefit communities. I've had the honor of partnering with her on a wonderful initiative called It's My Future Toronto, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Dean Dori to Yale University. Thank you.
Good morning, afternoon, depending on where everyone is. Thank you for this invitation, Forrest. And again, always wonderful to see you, Sheila, even if it's through Zoom. I'm really excited to have this conversation with this community, because I think in some ways, Yale has always been on the forefront of new thinking around design, and I'm interested in kind of how you would engage and interact with some of the things I'm going to talk to you about. So let me share my screen. So to begin with, I acknowledge the ancestral and traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat, with their traditional odors and custodians upon the land in which I am currently gathered. I always begin a presentation with a land acknowledgement because it is an important aspect of what we are talking about, and well, many people are talking about in terms of decolonizing design. And so one of the first steps in decolonizing design is actually understanding your sense of place and your positionality in relationship to the land and those who are the custodians of the land traditionally. So this leads into just a little bit of background. OCAD University, which is located in Toronto or Toronto, is one of the oldest and largest art and design institutions in Canada. It is the third largest art and design institution in North America. Clearly these images are pre-COVID. As Forrest indicated, I am the first Black and Black female Dean of a faculty design anywhere. I'm a design anthropologist, and I'm also African American. Those are kind of really important in terms of positioning a little bit myself, because what I'm really interested in is respectful design, which I'll talk to you about, and then how we can bring into different institutions diversity, equity, and most importantly for me, the decolonization of design. So the ethos of design at OCAD University in our faculty is respectful design. And it relates to the fact that as a design anthropologist, I'm really interested in the relationship between values, the way they are made manifest or tangible through design, and then how people actually experience it. And as a design anthropologist, I often spend a lot of time either working through the iterations between design and people's desired experiences, or going back and saying, there's an experience that's misaligned with the values that we want to have. And so one of the things that I've been noting is the way in which the values of design have been in misalignment. And one of the alignments that we've been trying to put forth at OCAD University is that design needs to be more respectful. And what I mean by that, I will give my beautiful faculty to explain that a little bit to you.
At OCAD University Faculty of Design, we practice what we call respectful design. Respectful design, what does it mean to the Faculty of Design? It means valuing inclusivity and people's cultures and ways of knowing through empathetic and responsible creative methodologies. It means deepening our relationships to the lives of materials and the crafts making.
The challenge facing design today is really to reestablish the relationship with nature. In other words, to design ourselves back into the environment.
For example, adding the Indigenous concept of 7 generations to inform sustainable design.
Good design takes a certain amount of humility. We have to recognize that we can do harm as well as good.
It's about need over want. Respectful design means acknowledging different values, different manners of production, and different ways of knowing.
The widest possible range of diversity with respect to ability, language, culture, and beyond.
Designing futures with inclusion and belonging for everyone. Come join us here at OCAD University's Faculty of Design and find out what respectful design means to you.
So again, the counterpoint to this is that in many ways, design has been disrespectful to BIPOC communities. And by BIPOC, I mean Black, Indigenous, and POC. And POC consists of basically Latinx, Asian, South Asian, Middle Eastern. So anyone who is of non-European and non-white heritage or is not Black or Indigenous. And I'll, in the next section, kind of talk about what these breakdowns actually mean in the context of design. The way this manifests in a very direct way is that for many of my BIPOC students, they feel like they have to choose between their nuanced cultural identities and being a professional designer. So they speak about their alienation from the curriculum. They speak about the fact that the models of who they need to be means that they can't practice maybe some of the traditional aesthetic approaches that they would find in their household or find in their cultural heritages. And it's kind of admitting to ourselves that the values of design in the way in which it's been talked about for many years have been and still are colonial, white supremacist, patriarchal, and capitalist. And that these relationships, these values have been quite harmful in many ways to community. So this part I'm going to go through a little faster than I normally go through because, like I said, I want to make sure that we have time for a lot of discussion and question and answers. But I want to kind of tee up a set of relationships to talk about the ways in which, in some ways, design has been harmful to BIPOC communities. So places like the United States and Canada, these are settler colonial states. This is coming out of the work of Eve Tuck and W.K. Yang, Decolonization is not a metaphor. And what they talk about is that in a colonial settler state, the settler colonial state, there's kind of like there's a triangle of relations and positionalities that exist. There are the indigenous, who are the original owners and custodians, as we speak about in our land acknowledgements. There are settlers who have come mostly from another place, and in the particular colonial state from Europe, in order to build a better life. And then there are slaves, so those who have been brought in many ways to the land and brought to the country for their labor and in a forcible or coercive manner. What this means is that in terms of the relationship to the land itself in the settler colonial state, the land has been stolen from indigenous and pillaged. And then in order to sort of justify that, that state, the policies and the law are assimilationist, which basically means that they've set up structures that are cultural or physical genocide against those who are non-European. Again, this is important in terms of understanding the role of design in colonization. So I'm going to go through, as I said, to talk about how design has affected different BIPOC communities. So first, speaking of the Black community, so their relationship to the land is that they've been brought involuntarily. So from 1619 in the United States was when the first Blacks were brought involuntarily to the United States, and in terms of their relationship to the sort of state assimilationist policies, they are unassimilatable. This has to do with the dominance of white supremacy as a cultural institution, where in 1681, that legally it was defined in the legal structures in the state of Maryland that those who were of European heritages and white skin could do things like vote, could do things like own property, could do things like basically kill someone who was Black or Indigenous and only be judged by a jury of their peers, and that the voice of the Black community or any Black witnesses would not count against those of a white witness. So in this way, that it doesn't matter that my name is Elizabeth Tunstall, which is an English name. It doesn't matter the fact that English is my first name. So when we think about the assimilation of the loss of culture, that as African American, there's so much African culture that has been lost, that the state requires, in many ways, as we've been talking about this summer, that Black lives not matter in order to maintain itself as the state in and of itself. Again, design's implication in this is the example I always talk about is the cotton gin, which was developed by Eli Whitney in 1793. And it's one of those things where you understand the way in which design, by design, is meant to be harmful. So the cotton gin, the purpose of it is to remove the seeds from the cotton fibers so that they can be woven and turned into textiles in most cases. Eli Whitney noticed that it would take a slave generally about an entire day to, again, remove the seeds from bushels of cotton. So by creating this innovative invention, was able to reduce the same task to 1 hour. The implications of this innovation, this efficiency that was gained through the use of this technology is that the number of slaves in the United States went from 200,000 in 1790 to 3.2 million in 1850 when slavery was officially abolished in the United States. And so again, in his letters and in his communications, he understood that this would be the implication of his design, right? To make it more efficient and expand in many ways the slave economy so that he and others could profit more greatly from it. But again, it's this one of those examples in which we can see clearly how design has been harmful to the Black community, and we have to address that when we think about what's the relationship to the Black communities to design in and of itself. Again, in looking at the positionality of the Indigenous peoples in the settler colonial state, that they are the original custodians of the land, and that they have actively fought against assimilationist policies for the last 500 years, including the I guess, human trafficking of Indigenous youth from the 1800s until as recently as the 1960s, putting into boarding schools in which they were not allowed to speak their languages, that they were not allowed to communicate with their cultures, they weren't allowed to participate in their cultural practices or communities, as a way to assimilate them into mainstream Canadian and United States culture or community or the state in and of itself. And so this manifests in design in the way in which every month it seems that we're having another controversy about the fact that a design company or brand has appropriated or misappropriated Indigenous motifs, Indigenous cultural practices. And the underlying assumption as to why, again, these brands, these companies would feel entitled to be able to take that is that their underlying thinking is that there are no longer any Indigenous peoples, that either the genocidal policies in which, again, Indigenous populations were literally decimated through disease, through starvation, through movement onto reserves out of their homelands, or assimilated, again, through these cultural policies and the breaking up of the family structure, that there are no Indigenous people in which you need to collaborate or to speak to in order to be able to use their motifs. And it becomes extremely painful because the motifs that are normally taken are normally sacred, so that the misuse of those designs have the effect in the Indigenous religious systems or spiritual systems of actually destroying and disrupting the harmony of the universe in and of itself. And so in this case, the British fashion label K2Z stole the sacred designs of the Canadian Inuit shaman Aua. And again, in the article that it talks about, it's like, you know, that the granddaughter of the shaman Aua just said all they had to do was to contact them and see if they could collaborate together on something that wasn't necessarily the sacred symbols, but something that spoke to Inuit culture in their designs. But again, the sense of cultural entitlement and the sense that there are no longer any Indigenous people is the mindset that allows this process of appropriation and misappropriation to continue in design. And then lastly, to speak into sort of the needing to be further disaggregated people of color category. But what is shared amongst these many different groups is that they've had to, in many ways, escape home to become new settlers to the land. And depending on their class and depending on the way in which their education is set up or the way in which they fit into the hierarchy of skin tones, they often have privileges in some ways to be able to choose which aspects of their culture that they are having to or willing to give up in order to be able to assimilate into the colonial state structures. But again, this process is always fraught, and design, again, plays a hand in this in terms of the stereotypes that it presents around POC, in terms of the misrepresentations that it is, that is in the way in which the community needs are represented. So this is advertising from the 1886. Again, advertising washing powder, but at the same time, it is actually promoting the Chinese Exclusion Act, which took place in 1882 in the United States and 1885 in Canada. And so it's this combination of, again, seeing the Chinese as being dirty, Uncle Sam, again, through law, being able to justify the discrimination against the Chinese people. Again, all of these things by design. But in all of this, I think it's important to remember that decolonization is about Indigenous land sovereignty. It is about the land. It is who are the traditional owners of land and who are able to, in the Indigenous communities among the nations, do they have the sovereignty to make decisions about the resources of the land and the cultural practices. As a dean of design, I can be an ally in that by helping to prepare the various communities for Indigenous sovereignty by liberating design from its modernist project. And what I mean by that is that, you know, one of the most revolutionary ideals that came out of Europe in the 1800s that is deeply embedded in our notion of design is the notion of progress, that through technology, you could bring luxury to the masses. And again, in the context of Europe, where you have an aristocratic class who lives a very good life through the extraction of resources from everyone else, the ideal of having a good quality tables or chairs or vases or all these sort of material objects through design that are through technology made cheap enough that you are able to afford it as an average everyday European citizen. That is an important notion of progress that was, again, in the context of Europe, quite revolutionary. The ideal of universal mankind, right? So the ideal of moving away from your traditional European nationals ways of expression, whether this is like black letter, or the ways in which we, again, in our studies are able to define what's Italian design versus French design versus German design versus Scandinavian design. The ideal of leaving all of that national and ethnic baggage behind to be part of a sort of sense of universal mankind, again, makes sense and is quite revolutionary in the context of Europe in the 1800s, where you have thousands of years of conflict, right, between different nations. But the challenge is that when you take that ethos that, again, was so revolutionary, when you think of like the Bauhaus, that many of them had to leave Europe because these ideals were so revolutionary. That when you bring that in the context of the United States, or you bring that in the context of Canada, this modernist design project becomes colonization 2.0, because the way in which you make cheap enough for the European citizen to have a good life is through the theft, again, paying zero or almost nothing for indigenous lands, and the extraction and exploitation of Black and indigenous labor, and then later the labor of the Chinese, the labor of the Mexicans, these things that continue today, so that not everyone can have access, cheap access to, again, versions of the good life through design. And again, this ideal of universal humankind becomes the justification for cultural genocide, where, again, especially for indigenous peoples, but also in the process of African peoples, where, again, you could not practice your religion, you couldn't practice your language, you couldn't practice your dancing, all these things that were forbidden in order to assimilate you into, again, a European notion of what it meant to be a human being. So if you're not genuinely depressed by all of that, let me talk to you about kind of how we in design can address, right, and make amends for the ways in which design has been harmful by really addressing diversity, equity, and decolonization. And this is where I'll go a little bit fast. So put indigenous demands first. At OCAD, what we've done is we've had an indigenous cluster hire to bring in indigenous faculty into our institution. Actually, probably next week, we're going to release a call for a second round of indigenous cluster hire just for the faculty of design to bring in 4 new faculty members. And again, the purpose of bringing this new perspectives in the institution is so that we are able to decolonize our curriculum, our policies, and our initiatives. And some of the ways in which this is made manifest is just the way in which, again, having our indigenous students articulate what decolonization means for them and to create space for them to sort of define it for themselves. The work of Howard Monroe, who was in the video speaking Métis, what he's done is that he's taken the 7 grandfather teachings, which in the context of here come from the Anishinaabe, but is actually pan-indigenous in the way in which it's used, and taking the 7 grandfather teachings and realign the design process in relationship to those indigenous principles, so that the research phase in the design process is now the respect phase, or the respect teachings, where if research is about trying to understand other people's perspective in relationship to what it is that you know or don't know, respect in some ways is understanding that there are other ways of knowing, other ways of being, which you need to understand in order to be able to position yourself as well. And so this idea of putting indigenous first is what makes the efforts that we do around decolonization and not just diversity and equity. Owning up to the institution's racism and white supremacy. So we underwent a presidential task force on underrepresentation, held workshops on whiteness without white supremacy, because 80% of my faculty are white. And so they need to understand their own histories and identities and the role in which they uphold white supremacist culture, but at the same time can generate identities of whiteness that are not based on that sense of superiority over everyone else. And again, drawing upon sort of Tema Okun's work around white supremacy culture, and again, how we as an institution begin to put into practice the different ways, different set of values in our institution, whether it's looking at power sharing instead of power hoarding, again, seventh generation thinking instead of progress, again, creating the need to embrace discomfort within the community in order to be able to change. Establishing authentic relationships to BIPOC communities. So this is me going everywhere in order to, in many ways, be present within community, but also create the conditions in which community feels they can be present within the institution. And so some of the things that I did is, like, in my first year and a half, there was an event called First Friday that I attended almost every week, just as a way to network and understand who was who in the community. Again, we've run a Black Reach design workshops that we offer to community centers for 8 to 12-year-olds to learn how to imagine, to make, and connect. But again, what's really important is creating enough of an authentic relationship with communities that they feel entitled to the resources and entitled to the space. So I was always happy, starting last year pre-COVID, that many of the community members were like, oh, Dori, we need the Great Hall for this event on, you know, November the 5th, and we need this, and we need that, and that. And to the extent that that was very difficult for my PA to handle, it was very warming for me, because it meant that the Black community, which had been in many ways neglected for a long time by the institution, felt that OCAD was a place that they belonged to, that they had entitlement to, and were willing to advocate for the things that they need and wanted in order to feel that the community, OCAD is just as much a part of the community as anything else. Again, we just finished a Black cluster hire last year. Before that, we had an Indigenous cluster hire. As I said, this year, we're about ready to launch another Indigenous cluster hire. And so what's really important in the hiring process is to make the call about BIPOC interest and not just your own. So this is some of the wording for our Black cluster hire, which brought in 5 new Black faculty members for the first time in 144 years of the institution in the Faculty of Design. What makes me really happy in this is that many people of the community and many of the candidates talked about how they cried when they read this position description, because it was the first time that they saw an institution value what is of interest to them and then value their lived experience. So there's some key terms in this around, you know, demonstrate how your lived experience inform a deep commitment to Black communities, that the topics of need within the faculty are Black speculative futures, multisensory storytelling as it relates to representations of Black lives, Black hip hop or Black cultural aesthetics. So all these things that, again, candidates sort of said to me, it's like, tick, I'm in Black speculative futures, tick, I'm into representations of Black life, tick, I'm into hip hop culture and aesthetics, and that's what drives me. So to see their interests reflected was really important in terms of them coming out and feeling that they can apply for the position. And for this particular call, again, we originally said 3, we convinced the institution for 5, but we got in the total process over 150 applications for this position. And that was only because in many ways the community embraced the call, because the call embraced the community. But in order to make this work, you have to redefine the standards of qualification to take into account systemic exclusion. Again, in hiring or even in the evaluation of new students, we already have an ideal persona in mind. So for us, there's a traditional academic where even in the qualifications, we ask for a master's degree or a PhD. We ask for them to already have 1 or 2 years of teaching. We ask that they have records of research that show in grants and conferences and book publications. All these things that if you've been systemically excluding from, you're not gonna have. So in our process, we thought of like, who are people that we know in the community who are doing excellent and meaningful things, just not in a traditional academic sense. And so we created a persona for the Praxis Star and a community connector, again, recognizing that, you know, if teaching in post-secondary means that you are able to transmit knowledge from one generation to another. You could be doing that as leading a workshop as a community connector, or you can be doing that through talks and workshops or presentations that you give to audiences as a sort of practicing designer. And so it's a way of kind of re-understanding that the way in which systemic exclusion operates, and then building a sense of what are the equivalencies that you're looking for to bring true inclusion of people who are, who have a different perspective and have a different understanding of what career possibilities are within the field of design, because they've been in some ways either excluded or have had very limited access to the post-secondary sector. And the last thing, and then I'll talk about, is just hiring in threes for critical mass. So this is the OCAG University Black faculty as of June the 3rd, 2020, and there's only sort of one person who's missing in this image. One of the things that's been really important is realizing that the success that we've had in organizational institutional transformation at OCAD is that we have students who are at the entry level, who are every day advocating for greater representation of themselves and their lives in the curriculum, in their faculty, in the way in which the institution is organized. We also have really powerful faculty, like in our institution, OCAD, Lillian Allen and Andrea Patona, who are kind of in the center of this, these squares. Like, they have been really strong influencers in the institution in terms of being able to help the institution understand the ways in which it needs to change. And why it took 144 years for the Faculty of Design to hire its first full-time Black faculty, and its first time full Indigenous faculty, is that the third aspect that they had was me, and not me personally, but me as a Black person in a position of true power as a dean, where if I say no, something doesn't happen. If I say yes, then something can happen quite quickly. So being in that position, when you're thinking about diversity and inclusion, you need to make sure you're bringing diversity and inclusion within structures of power, structures of influence, and that for those who are at the entry level, that they have opportunities for growth. And then you keep multiplying that until you reach critical mass. And you only know when you reach critical mass when the community themselves say that they feel like they can bring their entire selves into the institution. So these are some of the 6 steps that in many ways is OCAG University's attempt to make amends for the ways in which design has been disrespectful to Black, Indigenous, and POC communities. So putting Indigenous demands first, again, owning up to our racism and white supremacy, establishing authentic relationship to BIPOC communities, making the call for the applications about the interests of the community and not just what interaction designer or graphic designer that the institution wants. And then define the qualification standards that take into account that for many BIPOC communities, there have been hundreds and hundreds of years of systemic exclusion. So they will not have the same profiles. Some of them they might be, again, I talk all the time around super tokens. They might be super tokens like myself, right, who do that, but that's not going to be the majority. And the way in which the system changes is if you're addressing the majority. And then hire for critical mass, and particularly if you're able to hire in threes so that you have representation in power, representation in influence, and representation in growth. And so with that, if you want to sort of follow up with me, there's my email that I'm mostly available on Instagram and then also on Twitter. So I'm gonna stop sharing. Thank you.
Dori, thank you so much. I think your presentation is so rich and dense with material, and honestly, I think all of us were furiously scribbling notes of, oh, that's how you do it. So I think one of the things that you talked about earlier, which I think is interesting, obviously, there's been no academic institution that has been free from the difficult conversations that this year has elevated or escalated. They were always present, but I think this particular year has been much more palpable in terms of the necessity to have difficult conversations about, systems of power and oppression, state-sanctioned violence. Can you talk a little bit more about respectful design? Can you give us an understanding of respectful design in the context of how it might be executed?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that, like this summer was actually really very interesting growth in many ways for the institution and the evolution in terms of what we mean by respectful design. And partly because the institution had to come to a really strong reckoning in ways that people were more silent before. So the week of I think the really high protests around the murder of George Floyd, and again, we had similar situation here in Canada as well. So we were sort of, those things kind of combined. And this was actually the same week where we were going to do the announcement around the Black cluster hire. So we were like the results, like the fact that these are the 5 candidates who are coming out. And it was there was a really tense moment in terms of, like, again, the institution deciding, do we hold off in some ways of the announcement? Do we not talk about what we've done? And I had to think about it and then think about what's the language that we have to use to talk about what it is that we've done. Because again, this is when everyone is doing the black squares and everyone's coming to a reckoning. And I sort of sat down with the institution and said, but you understand that what everyone is protesting about is the fact that all of these institutions, whether it's COVID and the health system, whether it's the police, whether it's the justice system, they have all failed Black people, and then I would say also failed Indigenous people as well. But again, this summer was the summer in which sort of the amplification of Black voices were high, right? Were higher. The story that we have at OCAD University is that we are an institution that has actually, in this context, not failed the Black community. Because again, it's not like everyone else is putting up their Black, dots and their Black squares now, but actually for us, we've been in this particular conversation with our Black cluster hire now for like a year and a half, right? Like this is the end of this particular journey. But at the same time, we had many of our students on social media. Again, the Black faculty hadn't arrived yet, right? So they haven't arrived. They haven't started teaching. They haven't started making that change. So the students were quite vocal about the way in which the institution had failed them, like had failed to take into account their culture into the curriculum, had failed to provide models of them for how they might succeed, had failed in terms of even recognizing the hyper-visibility yet invisibility of being the only Black person in your class or in your year, right? So we had organized 2 workshops, well, not workshops, sort of town halls. We did one that was just with Black students and Black faculty and staff. And that was just us kind of coming together both to collectively grieve what is going on in the community, but also to sort of share information about what it is that we plan to do and going forward. And then we had another BIPOC forum, in which the BIPOC students were able to speak to power directly because we had a new president coming in, Ana Serrano, as a Filipino woman, or a woman of Filipino heritage. And so she came in literally within her second week to hear the students talk about, again, Black students, Indigenous students, POC students, the way in which all of the institution is failing them. But we also at that time, again, had that story of like, this is what we're doing to make amends. We accept all the criticism of the failure of our institution. This is what we're doing to make amends. We are hiring for diversity in ways that, like, again, other institutions are shocked, right, by our ability to transform our faculty as rapidly as we've been able to do it in the last 5 years. And again, we are changing the curriculum where one of the big complaints was that in the first year, you have to take a history of art class. And it was like, before it was, again, European history of art pre-1800, European history of art post-1800, and that's like what you had to take for the year. This year was the first year in which we flipped it, where you could take, in your first semester, you can either take global art history pre-1800, or you can take Turtle Island art history, which is Indigenous art history. And so again, the students who are in their second or third year didn't get to experience that, but we could talk to them about, this is what we're doing, right? And then talk about, now that you're going to be graduating, these are some of the programs that we're putting in place in terms of being able to support you as well. So like, as part of the Black Youth Design Initiative that I facilitate and organize, like, we have this Design 4 program where we put Black students into Black businesses for a period of 21 weeks, paid for 10 hours per week, $22 to $24 per hour, so that they have that experience of what it means to, first of all, run a Black business if they're interested in that sort of thing, or run a Black organization, but how to use their skills in ways that benefit their communities, because that's what they were complaining about, right? How this relates then to respectful design is that if you respect the fact that people come from different heritages, people come from different backgrounds, people have different ways of learning and being, then you, like, OCAD has no money. As an institution, we are very resource poor institution. But what we've done is that, taking that notion of respect, taking that notion of decolonization, we have prioritized our decision-making such that it's like, okay, I have 4 lines of hiring because we had some retirements. What am I going to strategically do with that? Okay, let's use that opportunity to do a second round of Indigenous cluster hire, because we've had some of our Indigenous faculty we hired before move into leadership. So now they're not in the classroom, and we need more cultural competency in the classroom. So we're going to take, again, what already is existing. Unfortunately, I'm not RISD, so I don't have a person who's able to donate enough money for us to have 10, Black cluster hires. But we as an institution, because we understand respect for difference, we can make decisions about the resources that we do have that make manifest our commitment to that diversity, right?
So Dori, I realized that I had a question from Catherine who was piggybacking on my question about respectful design. Her question was specifically around faculty critique. So, students are creating work and they're coming from their own lived experience. Faculty may be coming from their own lived experience. Is it possible to judge, quote unquote, successful design within a framework of respectful design? Do you see those being compatible?
Yes. Again, it has to do with, there's as part of the Black Youth Design Initiative, one of the projects we're engaging is called the Portfolio Project. And what we're basically trying to do is retrain the evaluation of portfolios so that they are not based on a cultural bias of sort of European, let's say, as a shorthand, because we know it's more complex, European Bauhaus standards, right? And so one of the things that we've been actively working on is kind of how do we document aesthetic excellence in different cultural traditions, right? And then through that different cultural traditions, how do we then, in some ways, train our faculty or train people who are hiring to see and guide them through a process that when someone comes from, let's say, an Afro-Caribbean heritage, guess what? There's not going to be any white space in their portfolio because the aesthetics of that region is about sort of, in many cases, multiple colors, and you use the space that you have. So how do we then train our faculty and otherwise to see that within this cultural framework, this is what excellence is? Now, again, we can have long discussions about what is excellence or whatever. So this is like baby steps in the sense of saying, first, let's get you to understand that there are multiple traditions of excellence in design that are very specific and local, but should be international if we were going to be really, if we were dismantling like the structures of sort of European-centric design and sort of white supremacist structures, right? If we were doing that work, they would all be sort of understood as being excellent in and of itself. So we're gonna do that work to retrain so that what you do is you understand the intentionality of those students, you understand the cultural expressions from which they're coming from. And then like what the purpose of any useful critique is to be able to have that dialogue of like, is your intentions meeting your outcomes? Is your intentions meeting your outcomes? And having like, again, some people may have deeper cultural knowledge and some of them may not, but they should, everyone should be able to respectfully engage with the understanding of what is the intentions behind the student's design and whether or not they're actually experiencing those intentions in a tangible way. And so that is how, and that's just being respectful to the person that you're trying to help grow, you're trying to help them, guide them into the most effective way of communicating and expressing themselves to others, right? So you're just one of those others that they're in dialogue with. But as an instructor, you have to do the hard work to make sure that you're understanding where they're coming from so that you're not misguiding them in terms of moving them away from their intentions. Like this is where oftentimes I've had to advise students because in their, that the advice sometimes they were receiving from their faculty who don't have the same cultural competency that I do, the fluency, let's say, that I do in certain cultural forms, that their discomfort with what they didn't know led them to misguide the students further away from their true intentions. And then I had to kind of come back in and sort of say, oh no, okay, I get what your intentions are. So check out this person and see if that informs, like if you can learn something from them around how, what are more effective ways to communicate your intentions, right? And that's what a critique should be like. That's what every critique should be at, regardless of what people's sort of background is. We should all, as critics, again, be really focused on understanding intentionalities of what it is that the student is trying to do. And then base our evaluation on, again, purely whether or not those intentions are being made manifest, but also making sure we're doing the work to understand how to guide them to make it more manifest if it's not there.
Hi, I'm actually a faculty in the graphic design department, so thanks a lot for getting here to talk. And I have a lot of questions, but I'll just narrow it to one. But I'd love to ask a lot of other questions. But I guess the question I have then is, I really appreciated this notion of modernism being colonization 2.0, the Bauhaus being migrating or, fleeing to the United States in the 50s and kind of introducing this modernist approach, but it kind of, being absorbed into this capitalism 2.0. And I guess my question is, in the continuum of design and a design school, in the continuum of a, capitalist sort of system, and design playing a key role in sort of promoting capitalist structures. How do you approach where students go afterwards, with the kind of, it might be different in Canada, but I think in New York or California, there's a strong pull of tech, for example, big tech, big technology companies or branding, etc. So, and then also, I'm not sure what the situation is that OCAD is. I'm not sure. Is it a private school or is it a state school?
Yeah, we're public, provincial.
Public, okay.
State.
So, a lot of the, not all, but, some art schools in the United States, say Art Center or Parsons, they're extremely expensive. Students come out with kind of
lots of debt.
lots of debt, way more than like when I graduated from Yale like 15 years ago. So I'm just curious, like, you know, where does an art school sit in all of that? And how do you sort of, you know, if you're decolonizing design within the education system, how does that continue in like the wider world of, you know, more kind of like capitalist society that design actively participates in?
So I guess I should say the wider world is decolonizing as well. I mean, one of the things that I think the opportunities that we have coming out of like COVID-19, coming out of the sort of protests around Black Lives Matter, Indigenous Lives Matter, Queer Lives Matter, all that, we have the opportunity right now where a lot of organizations are open to listening. And yesterday, actually, I gave a talk to Amazon Design, their design teams. And one of the things that I talked about to them is that, you know, the challenge that companies say they have with sort of decolonization, diversity, equity, or whatever is the effect it has on their business model, right? Because again, in the capitalist system, their business model is based on, again, like how cheaply can we get this done in terms of like, you know, exploiting labor, exploiting the land, in terms of like not having to pay for our lack of sustainability, but making the state pay for it, or the citizens pay for it, that sort of stuff, right? That has all been disrupted. Like every single business model due to COVID-19 has been disrupted. And so the thing I said to them is that you have already experienced disruption, and you've already have had to pivot very quickly in significant ways. So why can't you accept the disruption to your business model that bringing true diversity, inclusion, and decolonization would mean? Because you are now in the process of having to rethink and rebuild your business model. So why don't you rebuild it with these principles, with these understandings intact, right? As part of that mix of what you need to figure out of how you're going to go forward next. So in Canada, I think because like Toronto is one of the most diverse places in the world. So I think in terms of the industry and organizations, that there is much more alignment with the notion of respectful design in a place like Toronto. Like again, other places may not be, but in a place like Toronto, where most of our students go, that there's a openness. And what's been beautiful in terms of the conversations that I've been having with the businesses here, because part of my work is actually helping them to decolonize as well, as a way to, again, build that bridge between the learnings that our students are doing and the impact they're going to have when they come into their companies, into their organizations, right? So I do a lot of work to make that transition smooth for our students by building those relationships, helping the companies themselves get an understanding of what it is that they need and want to do. But also, like I said, right now, there's an openness to have these conversations. There's an openness to change. Our business models are disrupted, so we can disrupt them even more on the side of justice. And so, like, since August, I've given like 2 panel discussions and or keynotes to different corporate organizations each week. And I do so with the desire to push their thinking in a way to, again, create the conditions in which the types of students that we are graduating from OCAD University will flourish. But also that by bringing in our students who come from this understanding of what it means to be a designer, that they can show them the way of how to transform. And so what's been really interesting, like I said, in the moment working with the Canadian and the Toronto companies, is that they are looking to our students to guide the way of how they need to transform to be more inclusive. Because our students will come in just assuming that that's how the world will work. And they will bring that assumptions into the way in which they interact with the systems that are put in place in these companies. And again, there's friction, and my job is, again, to reduce that friction. But to the extent that they know that the young people bring the most innovative ideas, the young people will help them transform and be more competitive, that they are eager to see how the young people will push them further into the transformations they need to make. And like I said, the work, there's a rich opportunity that I feel will only last till about March, perhaps in my cynicism, to really push organizations and institutions to make the kind of change that will allow these kinds of students to flourish. So I do the work. I do the work.
So I think this might be a wrap. I just want to thank everybody for such a highly engaged, well-attended, final talk this semester. Dean Dori, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. I really feel like this is exactly what we all needed in this moment in time. So you yourself are a gift, and all the work you're doing is truly inspiration and motivation for us to be able to do more where we are. So I want to all of us go off mute and give you a firm welcome and applause. Thank you. Thank you all.